Hi everyone, in this tutorial or lecture we will talk about a very important method of storage in an Android device that is called Android shared preference. So shared preference is one of the very common methods that almost many applications are using and that you need if you want to program in Android. It is a storage, shared preference is a storage of key value pairs, just like a map, you know. In the map, we also store values as key value pair, the variables as key value pair. But the difference between a map and a shared preference is that in the case of a map and shared map, there is no persistence of the data. But in the case of shared preference, the data persists. From the persistence, we mean that even if you close the application, the data is remains stored, and when you rerun the application again, it's again loaded. The data is only lost if you uninstall or remove the application completely from the system. Otherwise, the data remains persisted. One more important thing, about the Android shared preference is that it stores a primitive data, like early data. Primitive is early data, that the data that you need at the start of the application. For example, the login information, for example, username, password. In the case of a calling app, for example, any kind of you can say a credit information that you may need to store. This is called primitive data that you need from the early screens need this is early data, the first screens that are using that kind of data. So it is normally small amount of data, and it is a private data. It's not public data, it's more private. Only the application that has created this shared preference can use it, and not the other applications or other parts of the system can access this data, or change it, or read it. Only this is only application specific data. Now in this map, this shared preference key value pairs, what kind of data is stored? It can be long, it can be string, it can be an integer, it can be a boolean variable. So almost all the kind of the common data types, or float, can be stored using the shared preferences. Shared preferences provides function to store and load these variables. Now the persistence data, the second point, we have already talked about the persistence data. That is, the data remains there, it is not lost even if the application is closed. That is called the persistent data. So that we have already discussed. Now before we discuss the modes, we can discuss first of all the APIs, that what kind of APIs are used, or what functions or methods are used to store, edit, or load the data using the shared preferences. And Now we will discuss what are the functions or the APIs that are used to load, store, and edit data using the shared preferences. And so we have make a clear picture now. So these APIs, and this is save, load, and edit functions that we discuss now. Uh, First of all, we see the load, how to load the shared preferences. Um, there are actually three kinds of methods or functions that are used to store the or to load the shared preferences to load the shared preference object in your code. Um, the names of the three methods are get shared preferences, get preferences, and get default shared preferences that you see now here in the picture and in the video on the slide. These three are those methods or functions that are used to load the shared preferences. First of all, we discuss the get shared preferences. The get shared preferences is used to load the preferences by name. You provide a name in the form of string variable, the name of your preferences.xml file. And this is the case when, for example, you have more than one preferences stored in your application. And that's why you need to specify by the name which preference you need to load in this case. And the next one is get preferences. So get preference, so the simple get preference is actually when you have only one default shared preferences to load. Hi. So we were talking about get preferences. Get preferences is used, as we said, is used when we have only one kind of preference in our application, and we only have, for example, one preference or some name.xml file which is used as preference, and if we use get preference, we'll just load this default preference file. But if we have more than one preference files, for example, we have one file as login preference, file as setting preference, one file as contact preference or credit preference, then we can use get shared preference and provide a name as a string and get the preferences and load the preference object. There is a third kind of preference that is called get shared preference. Get default shared preference. The get default shared preference is we take from the preference manager that is actually kind of managing the settings and all the, you can say, settings or any kind of things that are on the application context level, and we can set the application level parameters, you can say, using the get default shared preference. This is also can it does not need any string variable or name in it. So about the get preferences method we can access from within an activity, and we don't need to provide a string variable name to for the specific preference because there is only one. The get shared preferences we can access from the application level, or also from the activity level within the activity, I mean. And the get shared preference, we from the application level, for example, we mean the app context. From the app context we can also get the get shared preferences. And this get shared preferences, when we call it, it returns us a shared preference object, you can say. This get shared preference, as we said, this which can be specified by a name in the string. Whenever we call it, it gives us a preference, a shared preference object, you can say. So that is the return value, the shared preference for object. And then using the preference object, we can get any kind of variables that were stored, for any strings, any longs, any integers, any arrays that are can be loaded, by the get function, that was stored in the shared preference. Now we go to the editor. Editor is like also a class provided by the shared preference object that can be used to, for example, change certain variable inside the preference. And um, we can use functions like put string or put integer or put boolean and provide the parameter name. The first parameter is always a string, and that we need to store. And the next parameter is the string with the variable name, and the next parameter is, sorry, the string or the integer that we need to store the value, just like a key value pair, the put string, put integer. So this is edit. And then after we have edited or changed the variable, we can save it using the editor dot commit function, which is provided by the editor. And uh, so sorry so that is what is a little bit about our our shared preference object. Like we define it again. We have a get shared preference object, we have a get preference object, which is used for only one, if we have only one preference in our application. Get shared preference is used if we have more than one application shared preference in our application, and we can specify it by a string name by passing it to a parameter here. And then we have this shared preference dot editor to change or kind of save the changes that we did on the shared preference variables. And this data dot application dot package, and data and slash data, and then application package name and slash preference is the place where this Yeah, so this is the location where this shared preference file, so the object.xml file is stored, um, when we save it. This is the default location in any application. And now we come to the modes. After we have discussed the APIs that we use for these preferences, what are the different kind of modes that we can use in the shared preferences? What we need by the modes are, for example, these are the kind of modes. These are actually some, you can say, integer values that we specify when we call the get shared preference object. And these modes, for example, tell us that in what mode we are going to use our shared preferences. For example, this get shared preference is we see here. It's this get shared preference is the function. For example, to get this shared preference object, and this function has two variables in its arguments, as you see. One of them is preference name, which is the name of the XML preference.xml file. As we said, that the shared preference is actually an XML file format that is stored. And this here, and the second parameter is the mode. Sorry, wait a second. Yeah, so this second variable is in this function get shared preference is the mode where we provide any of these uh, values, you know, to define in which mode the preference is. Now we will discuss this mode a little bit, what these modes are and what they do actually, and what they represent, and what happens when we use this mode and as a variable, as an argument in this get shared preference function. Now we come to, for example, uh, how we use these get shared preference functions, you know, kind of, and how we kind of load them, and how we save the preference values in the form in inside the shared preferences using this editor, class of shared preference. And just kind of a small code snippet that is actually the one that is used for handling the shared preferences, loading, storing, loading, changing, and saving. These three steps we can define using this code. For example, this here we are using the get shared preference function to get this from the app context, to get this private pref our variable which holds the shared preference object. And this will have two variables, for example, preference name and context mode, which is the int mode, which is the integer value that we will have here. And then we will try to change we will load some string value, which is some key value that is stored in our preference object, and we'll try to change it. So in this function, the get shared preference, we have, for example, here the mode private, whose value is 0. For example, mode private means that for example, we have only our application who created this shared preference.xml file, or these preference settings files, is going to use this, and no other application is going to use this file. So that's why the mode is private, whose value is 0 here. uh, Now, what we have in the case of preference name, the preference name is actually the name of this .xml file, this preference.xml file, that because whenever we create or commit, we create an XML file whenever we try to this, because the shared preference is an XML file. This private preference is the object that holds the shared preference, as we said. And now we go to the next line. In the next line, we have, for example, this private preference object. It is calling the getString function, this object from the preference class, and giving a value of the preference key inside. This preference key is the name of or the variable name of the key, and its value will be stored in this string variable. Because we use get string, we could have used get int or get boolean, and here then we will get a boolean or integer or long or whatever we want, as the output value of this line. Now in our next line, we try to change this value. uh, So let's say that this value that we got by getting the string preference key from our preference object, we add a new value which is called plus my new value, a string, and we add it in a new string called new value, and now we want to store this new value with the key preference key, the value with this key we want to store, preference key value. This key will have now this new value. How we do it? We now create an editor handler, by calling this editor functionality from the shared preference class, and from the shared preference package we call this class editor. We get this handler, like we get this variable editor handler or object, and then from this private preference function we call this edit function to get this edit handler variable. Now this edit handler variable has function like put string, put integer, put boolean, or put long, whatever, and you use one of these functions. For example, put string, because in our case the value we want to store is a string value, so we use the same key, preference key, and we use the value text is here wrong. We should put here this new value, this new value should come here. So this new value should come here instead of this text, because this is the new value that we created. That was a typing error. And then we have we after we commit, uh, we are going to store this new value inside our preference key in our preference.xml file. This preference key is a key contained in this preference name.xml file, which has now this new value string inside it. So this commit editor.commit is actually is going to save, it saves the shared preference, and that is actually the whole process. First of all, we load here. You shared preference dot private preference is going to load the preferences in this first part. In the second part, for example, the string value, using the get string and giving the preference key. This from the preference name file. This name file has a key inside which is called preference key, and this private preference dot get string is going to load this key from here. So this is the loading process completed. Now we are going to edit, like change this value. So we add a new value to our value string by giving a plus new value variable, and then we create this editor from the shared handler editor variable by calling this function private preference dot edit, and then from using this editor we call this a put string function of this editor handler, and we change the value. Put string, it can be put int, it can be put long, it can be put boolean, it can be any of these put values depending on what variable we want to store in our preference keys. Sorry, so at the end we save our preferences again using the editor handler edit handler dot save. This is the save thing. So this save is happening here in editor handler dot commit. So that's actually it. So we defined all our APIs in detail. Hope you would have understood the save, load, and edit function. Now we can go through our modes, operating modes, these modes that we provide when we load our preferences up once more a bit. So the first mode is the mode private. This when we use the mode private as a parameter in get shared preference functions, it means that this shared preference will be only used by the application that created it, and not by any external applications or any other applications in our device. So this is kind of defining the privacy. It says an integer value of 0. If we use the mode append, the mode append is going to kind of append the newly created preferences after the old ones in this .xml file, and it's not going to rewrite it again. So this also has a certain So this also has a certain integer value, and it is given, it is passed here as an argument instead of mode private. And if we use the mode word readable, this means that the other apps cannot read, but they can only write, or sorry, cannot write, but they can only read the shared preferences created by your specific app. But this mode has been depreciated after the API 17, I think, because this kind of creates security loops or security holes in our application, because people can modify the data, sometimes the private data that we don't need to be modified. And then we have mode world writable. This is also a bit similar to mode word readable, but it gives extra uh, rights to the other application, that they can also write to the shared preferences created by your app. This mode is also deprecated by the API 17, deprecated in the API 17, both of these, and they are actually not used in the newest API versions. And then we have the last mode, which is the API, which is a multi-mode multi-process. Uh, so multi-process, as the name suggests, that this can manage multi-process for example, more than one process can kind of access the shared preferences. For example, if the shared preference has already been loaded, you can still be able to modify them, and change them. It is like this: if you apply this mode, this is called mode. Your shared preferences can also be changed even if they have been loaded. And that's the mode multi-process. We also have another mode which is called something like mode enable write ahead logging. So when this write ahead logging mode is provided here as a parameter, it gives us the opportunity to log uh, to to pro, to enable the write ahead logging by default, if we give this mode as a parameter. So this is a little bit of description about the some of the modes that you can use in the get shared preference function in the second parameter. And we've already described you before previously that how you use this get shared preference, and then giving the preference name, and how you load a certain key by get string or get int in that preference name.xml file, how you change them, how you save them, like these APIs. So this whole process of loading, editing, and saving of the shared preferences. So this was a bit of a description of the modes, and yeah, that's it for the shared preferences. We'll describe a few more details by going through the examples.